Islam is oppressive to women. Neutral. I was wondering which way this would go. And of course, it is a very complicated question. Depends on the woman, depends on the Islam, but overall, Islam is a patriarchal religion, okay? I believe that there's a clash of civilization between Muslims and Christians. Ah, that's really interesting. Well, there's the first place to start in the dialogue that we're going to be having on Wednesday with Muslim students. Next. Conflicts between Muslims and Christians are caused by the Islamic concept of jihad. Okay, disagree. All right, mixed results there. There's a lot to be learned in this dialogue we're going to be having. Okay, women and gender in Islam. Laila Ahmad argues that Islam speaks to people in two different voices. One emphasizing justice and equality, one emphasizing patriarchal values. I believe that Christianity or Judaism, like Islam, speaks to people with two different voices. Aha. All right, this is good. Okay. Critics of the patriarchal worldview of Muslim authorities and scholars argue that the Quran must be interpreted in terms of its principles rather than literally. They trace their understanding of the Quran back to early Islamic scholars, particularly Ibn Sina, who was very famous. He has a Latin name, that's Avicenna, and he plays a crucial role not just in Islamic tradition, but also in the Christian tradition. He lived 980 to 1037 in our calendar. He was a Shia Muslim, and the reason he's so important for the Christian tradition is that Aristotle had been translated into Arabic already. He was basically lost to the Western world, but he was read avidly by Muslim philosophers like Avicenna. Avicenna used his philosophy as a basis for writing treatises on medicine, theology, philology, the study of language, mathematics, astronomy, physics, and music. So much of the learning of the Greek world comes to the West through the Islamic world. Just so you know how important Avicenna was, he's most famous for a 14-volume work called The Canon of Medicine, which was used in Europe from the 12th to the 17th centuries. In other words, our medical knowledge came from the Greeks through Islamic physicians. And the most important thing about Avicenna was, in using Aristotle, is that he brought reason and revelation together. He said there is only one truth. And so God-given reason of human beings has to coincide with revelation. And for him, it was the revelation of God to the Prophet Muhammad. And so he argued that existence isn't just an abstraction, it's the work of a divine, self-causing thought process, which is God. And this powerfully came through and influenced St. Thomas Aquinas and the Christian view. Now I'm jumping 1,000 years to a man named Fazlur Rahman, who was born in what was British India at the time. And he was very bright. He was sent to Oxford University, where he wrote a PhD dissertation on Avicenna. And he went back to Pakistan after finishing his dissertation, but he was frustrated by the Islamic politics in Pakistan that made reform impossible. And so he eventually left Pakistan and came to the United States to teach. So throughout the Muslim world, there is a reform movement rooted in Avicenna that comes through Fazlur Rahman and then goes back out to many different Muslim countries. Fazlur Rahman argued that the particular passages in the Quran must be interpreted in terms of the principles that the Quran enunciates: justice and equality. And so if you want to interpret a particular passage, you have to know what was the circumstance in which that revelation was given to Muhammad. So for example, polygamy. In the Quran, permission for polygamy comes after what is called the Battle of Uhud. There was a war between the people in Mecca and the followers of the Prophet, in which the followers of the Prophet were defeated. And so many, many people were killed, and leaving widows with nobody to support them. And so Fazlur Rahman points out that there's a particular need for polygamy at that moment in time when the Prophet authorized it. He goes on to argue, in the Quran, unlimited polygamy was strictly regulated, with the rider that if the husband feared that he could not do justice among several wives, he must marry only one wife. To all this was added the general principle that you shall never be able to do justice among wives, no matter how desirous you are to do so. And so Fazlur Rahman argued that the overall logical consequence of these pronouncements in the Quran is actually to ban polygamy under normal circumstances. So now I want to give you an example of the kind of influence that Fazlur Rahman has had in generating an Islamic reform movement that's not just in one country, but is throughout the Muslim world. So I'm going to tell you the story of Mary Teasley. She was one of 8 children of a Methodist minister, and she is African American. In the early 70s, when she was still an undergraduate, she converted to Islam. She says that it was the emphasis on justice in Islam that attracted her to convert. After conversion, she chose the name Amina, after the mother of Muhammad, and she chose the last name Wadud, which means loving. In graduate school, she began to be aware of the patriarchal tendencies in Islam. She decided that if indeed the Quran really viewed women as inferior to men, then she would actually have to convert back. So she set about examining the Quran, and she turned to Fazlur Rahman for a way of interpreting the Quran that would reveal its true message. And she wrote a book called Quran and Woman, Rereading the Sacred Text from a Woman's Perspective. And in that, she argued that verses in the Quran used to justify the subjugation of women had been taken out of context or misinterpreted. First of all, the Quran has only been interpreted by men. There have been no women allowed to interpret the Quran. And men who believe that men are superior to women automatically have a bias and interpret the Quran to support their own bias. So her conclusion is that the patriarchal bias is in the men, in the interpreters, not in the Quran. She points out women came to be discussed in Islamic law in the same terms as material objects and possessions. Unveiling. In Arabia at the time of the revelation, women of wealthy and powerful tribes were veiled and secluded as an indication of protection. The Quran acknowledges the virtue of modesty and demonstrates it through the prevailing practices. The principle of modesty is important, not the veiling and seclusion. Veiling and seclusion is just one way you can manage modesty. All believing women deserve the utmost respect and protection of their modesty, however it is observed in various societies. So she's doing something really interesting here. She's saying that it's the modesty that's important, but modesty is culturally relative. What is modest in our culture is not the same as what was considered modest in 7th century Arabia. Islam, in its original articulation, is very patriarchal. Yet, I do not think that patriarchy is an aspect of Islam's universality. Patriarchy is one way of survival, but its time has ended. In 2005, she agreed to lead Friday prayer for a mixed congregation of Muslim men and women in New York. Now, traditionally, in the patriarchal view, only men should be able to lead the Friday prayers. This is the prayer service. You can see the men on one side, the women on the other side. It looks pretty tame. And yet, this unleashed a storm in the Muslim world. Egyptian and Saudi newspapers referred to her as a, quote, deranged woman who was collaborating with Western infidels to corrupt Islam. In Saudi Arabia, the Grand Mufti accused Amina Wadud of, quote, trying to corrupt the community of Muslims. Okay, so this movement that I've been describing, this reform movement in Islam, is called progressive Islam. And on the other side is Islamism, or people who want an Islamist government, so the patriarchal Islam. versus the justice and equality Islam. On progressive Islam, Amina Wadud says, our trajectory is to move towards the betterment of our own humanity as representatives or trustees or agents of the divine. That progression being arrested by a number of disruptions, like colonialism, has caused what we in the West have sometimes identified as an Islamic resurgence, this Islamist patriarchal backlash, which in the Muslim world has meant enormous poverty and an enormous gap between the poverty of Muslims and the wealth of the West.